Morning everybody, thank you for joining us. For one day only, I'm going to be Frank Field, because Frank's not with us today. And thank you particularly Alok and Neil for coming at very short notice. This is obviously, UC Managed Migration has just suddenly taken over every news channel out there, so it seemed timely to have you, before that debate kind of gets too carried away, timely to have you come in here and give us your views, but clearly an area that a lot of people are quite nervous about. So we're going to kick off with a question from Nigel.
So Minister, perhaps before we run through what we're worried about, can you just talk us through what you see as the biggest challenges or the biggest possible things that might go wrong with managed migration?
Yeah. Well, firstly, Chair, thank you very much for having us. Always happy to come and speak to you guys. And I suspect over the coming months we will spend more time talking about this. So I think the first thing to say from our perspective is that we recognise that we need to get this right. And we need to get this right, I think, particularly for those who are vulnerable. And if I tell you that we, of course, have been engaging with some of the key stakeholders. I personally have had individual one-to-one meetings. Neil yesterday held a workshop with about 70 individuals from stakeholder groups. Secretary of State's done a roundtable this morning. And I think the aim for us in terms of going forward is to continue to be really engaged with key stakeholders, particularly those representing the vulnerable. So that's my sort of starting position. We've obviously had the feedback from stakeholders. We've now had in the last couple of weeks the Social Security Advisory Committee's recommendations, which have come in. We're reviewing those, and obviously we will formally respond to those, and people will see, what it is that we've responded with as we lay the regulations. So I think from our perspective, it is one, to make sure that the systems and processes work. We do that together, engaged with key stakeholders, and that the testing process that we have, the sort of test and learn, obviously in very low volumes, and I think, as we've said, we will start that during next year, and then with the aim of from 2020 to actually build up volumes. So I don't know whether that gives you sort of some sense of where we are on this, but I think...
Well, I was just really, I suppose, just wondering, given your head sort of on the ministerial block for this, I mean, are there any aspects of this migration that you personally think, oh God, that's the real risk that we need to make sure we're watching out for, or that's something we ought to tweak before we go ahead? Is there anything you're particularly worried about?
So, is there anything particular? I mean, I want to make sure, as the Minister responsible for this, is that as we do the testing on this, we learn from the testing and we adapt from that. We take the stakeholders with us as part of that testing process before we get to any kind of volume. And obviously, what will happen is that before we move to volume, we will have the Infrastructure and Projects Authority will do an independent review of the work we've done before we push forward. So from my perspective, I think it's to make sure we get all of that right, because, I mean, frankly, Chair, I don't want to be sitting in front of you, a year from now and having a discussion where things haven't gone as well as we would like. So we're very keen to make sure that this works. If I can give you some sort of sense of the fact that we've obviously been moving people from live service onto UC full service now over the last months, and I think in the last year we've moved 185,000 people. We moved 185,000 people across, and of course we've got some learnings in terms of that migration as well. But I think it's fair to say that has gone smoothly. I mean, clearly we've not had.
Although the big difference with that, Alok, if you'll forgive me, is. Okay, live service is just a front end on the old system essentially, but you've still got people within the culture of the UC world. You're moving them from one UC system across. Yeah. These are people that have potentially have no regular contact with the DWP for years. I think it's quite different.
Yeah. So I didn't want to sort of negate the importance of what we're doing in managed migration. I just wanted to give an example of the fact that we are clear that we need to make sure our processes work before we start the process, and clearly, you will want to do the same.
I mean, I think the point with that one was we tested moving people from live service over in very small numbers, and we found we had some problems with that. We corrected for those for when we move to large numbers. So I think this model of testing and the model of getting people to make a claim we have tested. But you're quite right, Chair. Typically the type of claimant we're working with there is very different to the kind of people we will be managed migrating in 2020 and beyond.
And if I can just sort of describe then in terms of the process as we envisage it now, obviously as part of the testing and learning phase, we will want to understand, what are the triggers that work. So currently I think the plan is that there is a sort of 4 to 6 month phase where we sort of warm people up before we actually get to the stage of formally starting the migration process. So again, it's engaging with stakeholders and seeing, is it written correspondence that works? Is it text? Is it home visits for different groups? I mean, all of that will be part of the testing phase. As I said, I think the key thing for me is to make sure that obviously this works, but particularly this works for those groups that we would identify as being vulnerable.
So, Mr. Couling, this is quite a big step, isn't it? I mean, these regulations you're about to lay will be how you move millions of people onto a system which currently has many fewer. So what keeps you awake at night about this particular stage in the process?
Well, I think I'm on record at the Public Accounts Committee saying that this is probably the hardest bit to do. The good news is we do have this testing phase in place, and we're not presuming as a department we know all the answers here. So part of what I was trying to do yesterday, what the Secretary of State's doing this morning, is to invite people who have specific expertise around specific groups to come and give us their insight, come and help us to understand what it is we've got to do. And then also, I've been very clear with certain groups or certain organisations, we're in the market for some help here. So if you think about 1 million of the people coming across are on tax credits, they're known to HMRC, they may not be known to DWP. So how can HMRC help? How can the housing associations help? How can local authorities help here? Because this is a big task, and making sure that people do not stumble on the way is really important. There is nothing in our figuring or financing that assumes we want anybody not to make the journey from their legacy benefits onto universal credit. So there are no prizes here for people not making that journey successfully.
And Neil obviously mentioned HMRC, so they sit on the programme board for UC, so they're sort of fully integrated into that, into the design team. In terms of local authorities, we obviously, the LJ has observer status on the programme board. There is a chief executive of a local authority, Islington, I believe, who is a member of the programme board. So, I mean, I hope that gives you some sort of sense that we are already engaged with stakeholders, and we know that's going to be absolutely key in making sure this works. And we're not underestimating the challenge.
So it's a project that's already 4 years delayed from when it was meant to be fully rolled out, if I remember the original deadline. You're saying this is the hardest bit, but there's no particular bits of this that either of you are worried about, thinking, if we could have a bit more money, we could do this way, or if we could just have a bit more time, we could change this. There's just nothing in particular you're worried about?
Well, I think
I've got some suggestions which will come on to later.
I'm sure you have, Chad. We're happy to respond to those. But I think what I'd say, Nigel, is look, it is important to get all of this right, but what we've always said is that there will be a clear phase where we test, and we will make sure that we are talking to stakeholders so that we get our processes absolutely right, and there will clearly be an opportunity for us to come and explain these to you as we go along. So, there is that sort of scrutiny that comes from bodies like yourselves, but obviously at the end of the day, the IPA is also standing there and making sure that the process we have in place are actually going to work.
But there's nothing you'd change yourself.
I think it's the point of I haven't yet decided exactly how we're going to approach the task. The test year is about understanding that and getting that right, refining that. This is in 2019. We've always said in 2019 it'll be a test year. There'll be small numbers of cases. When we started in Sutton in 2014, we started with 20 cases. We'll start with very small volumes. You start with small volumes because it's easier to A, observe what's going on, and B, if you've made a mess of things, because people are not, lab rats here, people are people, we need to make sure they're supported on this journey. We can add that extra support in to make sure that they get safely onto universal credit. There are a host of things that I worry about getting that right inside of DWP and outside of DWP as well, because for all the public interest in universal credit, again, I'm on record saying that I am worried that we are, worrying people just about universal credit, and this process will work best if people engage with us, and we need to create an environment where they are happy to engage with us. So that's why I am hope to work as closely as possible as I can with all of the myriad kind of lobby groups around to say what are the best ways of doing this, and it will be different solutions, I believe, for different sorts of groups here as well. This is a very varied population in terms of their needs, and we'll need to tailor approaches to that to get that right too.
Okay, I think with the biggest stakeholder we need to get on the side of the Chancellor right now. But Chris, do you want to carry on for us?
Thank you, Minister. You both talked about tests, so would just be clear what tests will apply then? Because obviously there'll be two parts to this. There'll be the managed migration pilot, there'll be testing for that, and then there'll be tests for the full rollout. So what tests are you talking about then? Because I've just heard the word that there'll be testing. So what tests will take place that will then make you ready to make a decision to proceed?
Okay. So I'm sure Neil will want to sort of add some flavour to this, but from my perspective, it is first about making sure that we are co-designing the system together with these key stakeholders and taking into account what they think is going to matter. The intention, so as we do that, we will sort of come up with a plan of how do you interact with claimants, with potentially different types of claimants. What are the processes in terms of engaging with people who may be deemed to be vulnerable as opposed to someone who doesn't have vulnerabilities. And then when we actually come to the test phase, which will be later on in next year, what we will aim to do is to test basically all claimants and all benefit types to make sure that we have an understanding of how different sets of claimants will react. Obviously, the volumes are going to be very low, and the testing itself will be in a small number of job centres, as I think Neil has said, and then connected service centres as well. And I think there's a sort of thinking on, do we do this on a geographic basis or another basis? But I think currently we're thinking, geographic. But again, this is. I'm sorry if perhaps we're not being as prescriptive as you would like, but the reason for that is that, Neil can expand on this, but I think in the past when we've done rollout on UC, we've been incredibly prescriptive, which has not allowed an opportunity to adapt to what key stakeholders may be thinking and advising, and that's why we're doing it in this particular manner. But do you want to add anything on that?
So I think on that point, that's a really crucial one. I think also, Mr. Stevens, if I understood your question, you're asking about the kind of criteria we might use to judge, are you ready to go to volume? He's nodding, so I've got that right.
Yeah, quite a bit on that as well.
Yeah, so, the NAO in their reports make a recommendation that we would do that. We've done that at every phase of the programme. Every big phase of the programme, we've had a set of, we call them entry or exit criteria from the phase that we're in. And we have, on the bigger phases, had independent scrutiny in to say, are we deluding ourselves here? What does it look like to a bunch of other project professionals who've run similarly sized projects? So I fully accept what the NAO say about having a set of criteria. As I say, I think it was inspired by what they'd seen in the programme. I'm actually rather impressed by the way in which the programme is managed, the NAO were. They made other criticisms that you'll be familiar with, but in the report they do offer some praise as well for the programme. And I fully envisage that we will have such criteria. I would use the testing phase to judge what those criteria will be. So I don't want to commit to them now. I think one of the mistakes that was made in 2011, which Mr. Mills alluded to in his question, that's been going on for quite some time, universal credit, was that people got themselves locked into a plan that they didn't know whether they could deliver. And I don't want to make that mistake again. You know, we talk about learning from the lessons of the past. So we will set some criteria, but not now.
But you would look then at different groups, I think you had said, Minister, in terms of, so that would include, for example, a claimant who suffered domestic abuse. You'll be aware that there's been an inquiry in this committee before.
Yes.
You would look at the effects of those individuals and others and
sure.
how this would...
Sure. So I think, I've emphasised the fact that the key thing is to make sure we can identify particularly people with vulnerabilities. So there is a piece of work that is going on in the department and will obviously accelerate, where using the internal data that we have, we can identify what particular vulnerabilities somebody may have. So that's on one side, and it could well be in certain cases we have to engage with stakeholders as well in terms of identifying where we don't know whether somebody's vulnerable, actually work with stakeholders. I think the other side of it is how do you then interact with different types of claimants. So for very many people, they will have hopefully a smooth journey. You may get to the case with somebody who is vulnerable where there is no response to the initial contacts that we have, and then the question is working with the stakeholders to come up with so what do we do? Do we eventually go together with the sort of trusted stakeholder and knock on somebody's door to make sure that we can get them onto the system and they don't suddenly fall out of the system. Now, I mean, certainly all the feedback that I have been getting talking to stakeholders is that making sure we get it right for vulnerable claimants is going to be really important in this process.
Chunk of those that are moving across.
Yes.
Are you done, Chris?
Well, I've just got one final question then, Minister. Obviously, one of the other tests will be the department's capacity to deliver.
Indeed.
And I asked you a question on Tuesday in the chamber. I was slightly surprised at your answer because it's in relation to the pressures on staff at the moment in processing claims that they're having to deal with so many. The phone call volume that they don't have time to process online journals and process claims. So will that also be a test? Because obviously the concern that some of the committee will have is if there's pressures on staff just now to deliver on time, how is that going to affect managed migration?
Okay, so I think you're absolutely right to raise a sort of resourcing issue. So right now we have got in terms of, if you look at the volumes that we are taking on in UC right now, it's around 100,000 a month of people coming on. And I think one of the issues that was identified in the NA report was the whole issue around with the current capacity we've got, are we actually going to be able to bring down cost per claim? That means the people we've got now doing a bit more. I'm sorry?
Going and knocking on doors isn't going to help with that.
No, sure. Well, hopefully. Well, let me address that point. So, if you look at unit costs in March 2018, it was 699. Right now, in August 2018, that's come down to 545. And what we've always said is that the mix of the caseload also helps in terms of the number of cases that you can process. So in October last year, 55% of the cases we're dealing with were people on full conditionality. That's now dropped to 45%, and by the time we have migrated, we expect that to be 17%. So I think what I'm saying to you is, one is that we think we've got the resources at the moment. Having said that, part of the test and learn phase is that if we find that we're going to need further resources, then clearly we're going to have to address that.
Okay. So the question is, will it be a criteria? Almost certainly. And it was back in October 17. And in October 17, I actually put in an additional 51 million of expenditure into the plans for that year to cope with unforeseen pressures. Because when you make a decision like, do you go to scale, you can't know for certain. So, I mean, that had the effect of pushing the unit costs up, which, happened, but that was, I got criticism from the NAO for doing that. But I think it was the right decision because we've sort of quintupled the size of people on the Universal Credit Full Service since then. and performance has improved. Telephone handling times have come down. It does. So we're not saying we make judgments faced with the circumstances we're faced with, and we also constantly assess the capacity there of our ability to respond. Currently, at the moment, the average, so this is an average figure, to answer Mr. Stevens' question on telephony, is about 9 phone calls a day, taking an average of 7 minutes each to handle. But we're in the middle of implementing a new telephony service that allows when you ring up, if your phone number is registered with us, it routes you direct to your case manager. And there are some of the routing doesn't work if you ring up from a number we don't recognise, so we use a friend's phone. It's those cases that are going to the overflow telephony section, and they're the ones probably giving you the feedback, Mr. Stevens, they're getting lots of calls. But we're rebalancing that system as I speak to make it work more effectively.
Well, I think the concern, Neil, is that staff have went to their trade union who have sent a briefing to members of Parliament, and what they're saying is because of the length of phone calls, it's stopped them processing claims, and that, I think, is a real concern that we would have now, but also going forward with managed migration.
Except some of the phone calls may help you process the claim because they may be to answer the question that you may have asked the claimant in furtherance of that claim. What I'm saying is it's an average of 7 minutes a call at the moment with an average of 9. So I saw you asked that question. I probably felt cranky I hadn't briefed the Minister to answer that one. Probably haven't mentioned that to him before, but we are not seeing at a national level that the calls are overwhelming our processing teams, but that doesn't mean that in a processing team they might not be getting more calls. But on an average basis across the whole operation, 12,000 staff or so, that's the position.
And that's today's figure?
That's the last figure I've seen. It may be 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple of wrap-up questions on criteria, but quick one from Steve and then Ruth.
Very quickly, I agree with you, Minister. I think that identifying vulnerable people will be crucial. I just wondered what's going to be acceptable. Will a councillor be able to phone up the department and say, I know this person? Will a social worker, an MP, someone from Mind? What are you going to accept as this? I know this person's vulnerable and they won't be able to comply with your conventional processes.
Well, I think that's exactly what we plan to work out during the test and learn phase. I mean, I think we're sort of open to suggestions. I mean, we've started the dialogue with. I've met Mind and sort of various others of these groups in the last couple of weeks. And that's precisely what we will try and establish: is that who is it? Who is the sort of the trusted party who can make a judgment based on the interaction they've had with the individual that somebody is vulnerable and what that vulnerability may be.
And when do you hope to have clarified that, Minister? What's the deadline for knowing?
Well,
I mean obviously we all want to know so that we give the right advice to people.
Absolutely.
When do you expect the deadline for having clarified that to be?
Well, I would like to think that we've made some pretty good progress by the time we actually start the process of testing people in that very low volume in the system. So I mean, I hope don't want to upset Neil here, but I would hope in the sort of first half of 2019. That's exactly the sort of things that we'll be establishing.
First half of 2019. Thank you.
Ruth.
Thank you, and I think a huge number of voluntary organisations will be very pleased to hear that you're looking again at assumed consent, because it's been a very, very big issue in the whole of universal credit, so it's good to hear you're aware of that. You also acknowledged, Minister, that the conditionality plays a key part in how efficient the system is, and obviously, as your recent report showed, then in-work conditionality is far more difficult to implement than out-of-work conditionality. I think Neil gave an assurance to Unison that in-work conditionality would not be proceeded with when DWP starts to move people across from legacy benefits to universal credit. I had that in writing. Be really good to receive the Minister's assurance that in-work conditionality will not be looked at the same time as managed migration, because the two will obviously impact on work coaches and workload as well as individuals.
So the question, let me do.
Sure.
So, but you can then
Yeah,
sure. Which is, we don't do in-work conditionality at the moment. What we did.
So the pilot's finished.
So the pilot's finished.
Okay.
We have some other piloting activity going on, but in the standard universal credit full service offer at the moment, there is no in-work conditionality. Mm-hmm. And what I said to Unison was that ergo there will be no in-work conditionality in managed migration. Should the test produce something we want to implement, then later on down the line you might envisage the two intersecting. But right now we have no plans to use in-work conditionality around managed migration. It's a piece of policy, and I think we've talked about this in the committee before, certainly with the chair. Maybe it was before the 2017 election. I can't remember exactly now, but this is work where nobody's doing this across the world. So we are doing a proper evaluation of some tests that we're doing here, and only when all that is complete will we know whether it is worth investing in in-work support in that sort of regard. So I don't envisage it being part of the managed migration exercise, and that's what I said to you.
Okay, could you just confirm to the committee, maybe not now, but how many people are, you said there's little bits of work going on at the moment, and how many people are claimants are subject to those little bits?
I think there was about £7 million allocated in the last budget for some testing activity for the next 4 years. Is it eight? Thank you. So it's small beer. It's a set of small tests. We'll happily give you a note about that.
Okay, that would be helpful, because individual cases will come to MPs if there's particular stick rather than carrot approaches being used, I suspect.
Thank you. I just want to, before we move on to the migration process, I just want to nail down a bit more about this criteria we've been talking about. In my head, as a business person, I would expect to see a whole list of KPIs, criteria, whatever you want to call it, for internal measures, how long calls are taking, work coach workload, number of vulnerable claimants per work, there could be a whole host of things. And external ones, which I think is more what we've been talking about so far this morning in terms of showing that the system is preparedness for big volumes coming on, so that the customer experience, so percentage of claims paid on time, for example. And the NAO, as we touched on, have also given, not did it for you, but given some indications of what sort of criteria they'd be looking for. Do you accept that those sort of two levels of KPI criteria would be useful? Do you plan to work on them? Will you be making them public? Because I think the NAO have pushed quite hard on that around transparency. And would bodies like this select committee, like SAC, like NAO, for example, get to see them before they're finally agreed?
Well, let me start with that. And I mean, so you're absolutely right, Chair. We will have to have sort of metrics, and particularly in terms of decision to expand. We will have to make sure that operationally we can tick the box in terms of operational readiness, in terms of efficiency of the service, in terms of being able to support vulnerable claimants, making sure that the functionality is in place.
Cost per claim probably needs to be in there as well.
So,
all of it.
But what I would say to you is that I think in terms of determining what are the precise metrics, that will to a certain extent come out of the testing phase as well.
But you should have some already, presumably, about the existing system.
Sure. So I mean, yes, we do. We will have things like payment timeliness and others which are already there. But I think again, I think what's going to be important to make sure that we learn from this test phase as to, because there may be additional metrics that we think actually this is quite important, particularly given the cohort of people that we're moving across. And I mean, I certainly be happy to come and talk about those with the committee in the future.
I mean, the committee's seen our previous set for October 17 via the IPA reports. So we work in that way. The thing I'm trying to avoid doing is setting them all now when I don't know. I don't know enough yet about, for example, what the cost of a managed migration claim might be.
Yeah, we need to work out your plan.
We need to work that out because we need to work out the support that claimants are going to need. So I want to try and judge that in the test phase before I go hard and fast on that. But in terms of the areas we'd explore and the sorts of kind of areas, yes, we've talked about those already today. There'll be cost. There'll be, are you dealing with vulnerable claimants successfully? I think payment timeliness, probably not, because the way in which this will work, managed migration, is we've got to get the payment in place, so it needs to be 100%.
Do you think maybe, Nigel and Steve both want to come in. I was going to suggest rather than, I'll take both your points, but because I'm conscious we've got a lot more to get through. Perhaps not now, but would you both commit to coming back to us with what sorts of things you're considering as criteria? I think essentially what it is, it's about us and claimants and the stakeholders that work with them having a comfort blanket of, they've done this, the system can handle big migration now. And I don't think anybody feels that yet.
No. And so, Chair, of course we have
can we in the NAO be part of that criteria kind of setting?
So we will, of course, come back to you, but the only thing I would ask is that if you give us a little bit of time to actually start that engagement process with stakeholders properly, so that we can, rather than come to you with something very general, actually start that discussion. So later on next year we can then have that discussion around metrics. I mean, are you okay with that? Yeah.
Okay, Steve, since you're itching.
I was just surprised listening to Mr. Couling. I mean, I accept the Minister has come to this after it's been through a number of hands, but I was very surprised to hear you say, I haven't worked out any of the costings yet. I would have thought if I was in charge of a big programme that I knew was going to eventually migrate to include everyone, I would have been working out costings at a very early stage. They might have been very provisional and they might have been subject to a lot of revision, but I would have expected that to be a basic. I don't know what happens in the business that you do, Chair, but I would have thought that was a starting point.
Well, let me clarify that, because you misunderstood, Mr. Bouquet. I have a core costing line inside of the Universal Credit Plan. Okay. You can overemphasise the impact of managed migration on the task of rolling out universal credit. In any 1 month, it's 24% is the maximum of the flow coming into the operational organisation. What I was saying was, around those central costs, I actually want to know what the real costs are, so I've estimated them. But it would be pointless to set a criterion right now at that level until I've worked with some of these groups to understand what is it actually going to cost to bring people over.
Is it possible to see the estimates so that we can all see how you're progressing?
Well, it's in the NAO report. It says what the unit cost needs to be by the end of the rollout period.
Well, for things like a face-to-face interview or a home visit?
It's not broken down like that. It's set up in an overall kind of unit cost figure.
Plan to get X million people across.
And I might need more, or I might need less, and some groups might be easier to do, other groups might be harder to do than we envisage. They're kind of central estimates right now. What I have found with running the programme, because I've never overspent the programme in any of the 4 years I've running it, is that there is enough play within the figuring to be able to do the right things, like putting in extra money into operations, for example, than I planned to do last year, and still balance the books. So I'm reasonably confident about being able to do that. But before I set criteria and publish them all and people start saying, well, you're off here, you're off there on these, I want to be sure I'm setting the right kind of cost. That's all I was saying, Mr. Bouquet. Sorry if that wasn't clear.
Nigel, did you have something quickly?
I think Mr. Couling offered us a 100% benefit timeliness target, so that seems to be quite a good one to accept.
Well, I think the way in which timeliness is understood now and the way in which timeliness will work for managed migration is a completely different concept. Because what we are doing is We are moving people who have an existing flow of benefit income onto a new flow of benefit income. That has to be in place for that to work. So it's pointless to be saying, it needs to be 90%. That means a 10% fail rate, okay? That would be, for some of these groups, absolutely awful. So it's a different thing to payment timeliness than what everybody's currently assuming now.
Except you're not moving them, are you? I mean, strictly you're ceasing one claim and inviting them to start a new one.
And there will be a gap.
No, not necessarily, because the way in which you handle the process, and this is what we're talking to some of the stakeholder groups around now, is before you initiate we can't initiate a termination, before you terminate the legacy entitlement, you can do a lot of work making sure the person is ready to jump off into the UC world, and you can catch them then and take them on that journey. And that's what we're trying to do here. So there's lots of focus at the moment about what happens when you switch off. My focus is on before that and making sure that goes, because that's the place to get this right. Once you've switched off, you're under the organisation, the individual, whatever, they're under a lot of pressure. So it's that initial phase that's the critical one here. I think that's being a bit lost in the debate at the moment here.
I'm intrigued by that a little, because let's take a tax credit claimant who's with no special vulnerabilities. Their engagement with their existing system will be the annual claim they have to make. Are you really suggesting that if you write to them and say at the end of October your tax credits will cease and you need to apply for UC, and as long as you do it by the start of October you won't have a gap? I mean, I just can't envisage you're going to spend the money going around knocking on their door if they forget to make that application. At some point you're just going to say, look, you haven't done what we asked you to do. Sorry, that one's stopping. Yeah. It's up to you now to make the claim when you want it, aren't you? I
mean, one of the reasons we've got RC embedded with us is they've got a lot of experience doing this every year, because a very large number of people do not renew, and they have to run around chasing people to get them to renew, or picking up pieces because there's a gap in their kind of tax credits. So we are trying to take that learning into the programme, and what is it we can do to make sure that that doesn't happen. We've also got the problem of just recognition with tax credit claimants as well. So a number of them don't recognise that they're on a form of benefit. As far as they're concerned, they're customers of HMRC, and they are, strictly speaking, customers of HMRC, and they just don't recognise the DWP. So there is a process to design and work through with HMRC about what is the best way to bring tax credit claimants over to universal credit.
Can I just come in about this, the whole managed migration thing? You talk a lot about the stakeholders that you work with. Is one of them the Disability Benefits Consortium?
Yes.
Okay, so for those who don't know, that's a collection of around 80 different disability charities and mental health charities, Leonard Cheshire, Royal British Legion, Trussell Trust. And one of the things that they've sent us in their briefing is a point where they say managed migration is an extremely misleading phrase. Under draft regulations, claimants will receive a letter saying that their current benefits will cease after a month, and during that time they will then need to make a new universal credit online application, which is exactly what we've just been talking about. They're saying that because of people's disabilities, they may not have any way of kind of doing that, so therefore they say managed migration is a misleading phrase. How would you kind of square that circle?
Okay, let me start, and then Neil can address it in more detail. So, I mean, I don't think the intention is to sort of mislead. I mean, it is a phrase that we have chosen, it's managed migration. So, but in terms of the way it's going to work, is that what obviously for everyone is not going to happen is that suddenly the first thing they hear about having to move to universal credit is a letter that comes to the door. Yeah, there is a sort of 4 to 6 month period of effectively sort of warming people up, either through the media or indeed some sort of orientation literature that is sent to them. So the intention is not that suddenly you start the process and within a month it's all done and dusted. So there's going to be clearly a process. Now, then what we've said is that obviously, when you start when you send them the letter saying that please now sort of make your claim, you will then get sort of reminders after that. It could be that where we have people's contact details, we are obviously sending them a SMS, a message to the phone. But can I just assure you on this point about the people with the vulnerabilities, that is precisely what we want to make sure is that if somebody hasn't responded to us, we have hopefully already identified them, and we work obviously based on the information we've got internally, but also the conversations that we have. And I think going back to this point that Chris and Steve were making about, so who is a party who can identify somebody as having a vulnerability, and having identified those individuals, then actually that's the point at which we then have another set of exercises that we have to do. And I just want to be absolutely clear about this, is that what the regs don't say is that you have a month and then that's it, it's all turned off. What it says is a minimum of a month. So we can actually extend the period of time somebody has before they make their claim. I mean, please, is there anything I've said which is inaccurate?
So it's really sort of echoing the explanation that I was trying to give earlier, which is, I think, out there, groups like the Disability Benefit Consortium are assuming that when we get to the end of this process, end of a process, we switch off people's benefits. We have not said we will do that. And the work we are doing at the moment is, what do you do at that crisis point where the claimant has not responded to various attempts? What do we know about that claimant at that point? What do other people know about that claimant? What should we then do? It does not follow.
It sounds wonderful, but you can't tailor that to individual people.
Well, we were talking about carers yesterday that may not be in the system, long-term carers that may not have reclaimed for a long time. How do they pick up that they even need to contact you?
Exactly. So we're mixing a number of things up here between how do we orientate people and get those who can self-serve and work their way through the process and proceed mainly fine through that, maybe with a little bit of support, and how are those who ignore the letters, stick them behind the clock on the metaphorical mantelpiece and just don't respond. What we are not in the market for doing is just switching off people's entitlement after 3 goes of 2 letters and that's it. Well, this is what we're talking to various groups like the Disability Benefits Consortium about, is what's the best thing to do then? What's the best way to act? I think people have read the regulations and not realised that with the regulations there's a bunch of processes and there is something about how we develop the wider environment that is supporting people here. So, for example, one thing I'm exploring with some of the housing associations is they know their tenants. Could they help in this process to both with the orientation and making sure that people know when the letter comes to start to engage with us and work it through and support them on the way. A number of housing associations already do this. If you've ever talked to Curo, they already have a team who support their tenants through the journey on universal credit now. So this is the kind of thing we're exploring. But the mistake to make in reading the regulations is that somehow at this point in time it's all switched off, and then because that would be a disaster for the claimant, and it would also be a disaster for DWP because those claimants will all appear 2 weeks later saying, I've not had my money, I'm in terrible distress. And the hardest thing to do in benefits administration, it's where I started out my professional life, is put people's money back in payment. It's labour intensive, they're a bit traumatised, you're dashing around trying to fix everything. So that's not the world we're trying to build into.
I suppose the difficulty is, because it is such a vast task, I mean, you don't need us to tell you that, and there are so many people involved and so many vulnerable people involved. The fact that the regs currently are very stark and light on detail leads people like us to have 1,000,001 questions, or what if?
Yeah. No, these are, I'm not moaning about the questions at all. These are all very legitimate questions, as I said to the groups yesterday. I mean, we started the day with the department listening to them rather than us telling them what was going to be going on. But the point here is, yes, it's a large number of people, but In maximum, it's about 65,000, 75,000 a month. Okay, I am already doing 100,000 a month on Universal Credit for Service. Those flows will increase as we complete the rollout. We're about 80% rolled out now.
So they're different kind of claimants?
They're different, yes, absolutely, but they're not as time pressured either as a new claim. Because a new claim, that's why we have the timeliness standards for those. They haven't got any money in payment. These claimants have money in payment, so we've got time to get it right. We can intercept the process at any point. So there are bits of the report, and I was showing a chart yesterday's groups in red where the bits you can't move, but there's more green on the report where you've got choices and the opportunity to flex the system.
And presume that's why the migration period has lengthened, because there'll be a bulk that you expect to go across dead easy, finish, job done, and others that you will need much more manual intervention with when the 3 letters haven't worked or whatever, and you're approaching it with a more individual approach. Is that partly why the length of migration is so much longer?
Well, so I think what we've always said is that the migration period will take place from 2019 to 2023. That is still the expectation. But we always say, and we say this in all statements about universal credit, is that we want to make sure that the process works at the right pace. But I think the intention right now, we're looking out 5 years from now, but the intention right now is that the migration process will take place from 2019 to 2023, with starting the testing of very low volumes from the middle of next year.
Okay. Nigel, sorry, I'm trying to fill the questions a little bit. I promised Ruth next.
Thank you, Rick. Can I? Moving on then, from you were saying about at the moment the regulations are very draft. Obviously, we're looking forward to seeing the SSAC response report and your response. Will this committee get the opportunity to scrutinise those documents before the regulations are laid, please, Minister? Because that would hopefully put some of our minds at rest that all these issues that we're raising now have been looked at. Well,
I think so. Our intention right now is that the Social Security Advisory Committee has spent a lot of time looking at this. They've also taken evidence from a very large number of people who put in the evidence. So, and one of the discussions I had with the chair very briefly yesterday was that, in a way, some of the points that you're raising, we are very much thinking about, and what I don't want to sort of say is that precisely where that thinking is right now, because I'd rather we come to an informed view when we respond to the Social Security Advisory Committee.
But there's nothing that we're saying that's surprising to you, put it that way?
Well, I don't think so far we've heard anything that others haven't said. In fact, you are reflecting some of what quite rightly stakeholders are saying to you. So I think from our perspective, we probably have a pretty good understanding of where stakeholders are and the Social Security Advisory Committee is. So I think the response we give will be the response that we give to them. And obviously we'll have a debate on this in Parliament, there'll be a vote and all that sort of stuff, so there'll be an opportunity to comment. But I don't think in the timetable right now we are envisaging that there will be a further sort of scrutiny process of this, because I think that's what, as far as I'm concerned, the Social Security Advisory Committee has done for a period of months now.
I think probably, I would echo Ruth's view. If it were possible to ask whether it's Esther's decision, I don't know, or who would make that decision. I think in the spirit of genuine partnership and trying to navigate this incredibly tricky landscape together, if there were an opportunity for that as a critical friend, I suppose, like SAC.
Which is what we're here for.
Then if it were possible, that would be appreciated.
Well, we're happy to take that back.
But you can only ask the question. Thank you. Nigel, really quickly, and then I do want to move on.
What happens if some advisors or some claimants get the feeling that they'll be worse off on universal credit, so they actively decide to delay applying? Because if what you're saying is we'll never stop the legacy benefit until they've actually applied, you might find some people think the best thing for them, probably foolishly,
because there are websites out there that
tell
you
it's
which
just not to apply.
On.
So, what do you do in those situations where you've got active non-compliance rather than just mistaken or vulnerable non-compliance?
Well, so, if you are currently on benefits and we're moving across, you're obviously going to get your transitional protection. That's the whole point of this. So, And actually, it's part of it is also explaining what that means to people, because there's a lot of noise around universal credit out there, and obviously what would not be good is if people misunderstood what it meant. So I think that's part of explaining to them that actually, you will not effectively sort of lose out as a result of this move. And I hope that, that's again something that we work on together with the stakeholders, and I hope what that will ensure then is that people say, well, okay, then, I can move across.
The risk is, you say we'll never actually stop someone's legacy benefit, and they say, great, I'll just never apply for the new one then, and then you end up in a strange standoff of people being advised or choosing just not to engage with you.
So I think that's to paraphrase what I said rather than what I said. So what we are trying to do is to get to a point that before you make that decision, you are absolutely certain that this is not a vulnerable person, and so forth. The other thing is, there will be a very small number of people, I suspect, who will not want to claim. They may have a very small entitlement to tax credits, and they may not want to come across here. We can't make people claim here. So, the claim process, the reason why we have a claim process is to fulfil that requirement under law that people make a claim. But, in general, we have said to some of the lobby groups asking us here, we are open to suggestions around this issue.
You almost need a logic gate plan for every type of claim, and if this happens after 3 weeks, if that happens after 4, do this, do that, and that presumably is the sort of detail that you're going to pull together.
I agree with you in a planning sense. I'd be nervous about putting that into an organisation, because my worry is you build a kind of computer says no approach there, and if you fail to do X, Y and Z, this is what I do.
But equally, discretion doesn't always work either.
No, but I would rather have the reassurance that there was some discretion and thought going on to what is quite a big decision in that space, than a kind of, you might get a checklist approach coming out of that. So I agree in the planning sense you need those decision trees effectively, but you've got to be very careful, especially with big organisations, that they don't think, right, it's the equivalent of, the operation was perfect but the patient died. We've just got to avoid that sort of building that mentality.
But it's a balance of both, I think, isn't
exactly.
it?
I agree.
Exactly.
Can I just exhaust the question? I still, as I mentioned yesterday in the chamber, I do not understand why we are not even trying, or it's not being publicly shared if you are, some kind of automated migration of data. I find that mind-boggling.
Okay. So can I let me start on that.
Maybe not even for all claimant types. Perhaps HMRC data flows are too tricky because they're not DWP owned. I don't know, but I can't believe we can't do it for any population.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is so by the way, this is something that we're giving some sort of thought to at the moment, and Neil might want to say more if he's able to at this stage. I think the limitations are that the information that we need for universal credit will be more than the information that is perhaps currently contained with claims for these individual benefits. So to give you sort of one example, we are going to, obviously, there will be a capital limit. There's a 1 year disregard, but there will be a capital limit. That is not currently within the tax credit system. And I think the other thing that we are a little bit sort of wary of is the fact that we effectively tried doing as a department pre-population when we moved people onto ESA from income benefit. And we see now kind of the result of that, in the sense that people were underpaid their benefits. That's obviously something that we are putting right now. So I think we would rather try and get it right at the beginning, rather than get into the situation where we have part information, we start sort of paying people out, and we suddenly find that actually we've underpaid people. The stat that I think has been used in the House quite a lot is the 2.4 billion of underpayments that we have currently. And I certainly wouldn't want to be in a situation where we are going forward suddenly doing some big leap exercise because we were found to have underpaid a whole number of people. Did you want to expand on this?
No, just to say that pre-population is at the heart of the problem about IB to ESA. I think there was an urgent question on this morning. So In terms of, as the chair asked us yesterday for the department to learn the lessons for universal credit, we're trying to learn the lessons. But we are actively looking at, can we reuse some of the information? If you think about the challenge of proving your identity, a bunch of the HMRC claimants and also the DWP claimants have already proved their identity. So do we need to put them through that bit of the identity process? Can we do that for them? So we're looking at that, and we will exploit opportunities as we see them. But the fundamental problem with IB and ESA was we pre-populated their claims. We made an assumption based on the evidence that we had that they didn't have entitlement to income-related benefits. And that's what's caused the mass underpayments there.
So does that say as much about the complexity of the old system then?
Yes.
It
does. I mean, there are 700,000 people who will get around 2.4 billion extra through take-up. Unless I gather the information to allow us to judge the claim properly off them, we won't get those take-up effects.
And is our data management so poor in government that we can't, even on somebody's national insurance number, we can't pull all the data together? Even if the systems are different.
Some of these systems are built in the 1970s and 1980s. The tax credit system, as you may or may not know, given the trials and tribulations of that reform, is effectively a shrink-wrap computer system. It is not easily adaptable to make changes to it to extract that kind of data. So we are looking at ways. We are not. I do not think people arguing for pre-population have the wrong sentiment at all. And I said this to the groups yesterday.
The group of people on terminal illnesses, for example, you really don't want to be writing letters to them.
No, I was going to offer the to an earlier question when I mentioned we've moved 185,000 people over from the live service. There are 3 people currently in medically induced comas at the moment, so we clearly cannot move those across using our existing kind of processes, and there will be those sorts of cases here. So we want to look at if it is because people will already through the DS 1500 process may not know they're terminally ill, but we may know they're terminally ill. So there will be some bespoke stuff we will do here as well around some forms of pre-population, but a general can you pre-populate, which is something I think Disability Benefits Consortium, stuff you may know, others have asked us to do. I don't think it's a practical feasibility, nor do I think it's desirable given the implications it could have for take-up. We could recreate the IB to ESA problem if we're not careful here.
Could I ask if the committee agrees? I'd like to personally really feel like I had exhausted that demand and that question about pre-population. You must have done a significant amount of work already looking at the original data to see what is and what isn't possible. Could you share that with us as the committee? We'll think that would be useful, because I'm a bit. I can imagine very old clunky systems, but I'm still a bit unconvinced that we can't do something a bit, or what the amount of individuality of kind of claimant types that you might be able to do something with. You've obviously thought, well, those have got no hope, that data we can't touch, that has to be manual, but maybe we could with those. I'd just like to get a sense
So I'm working on the art of the possible here, so I won't be able to tell you exactly yet where we've concluded, but in terms of our sort of strategic decision, could you pre-populate or not, I can certainly let you have some information around that.
Appreciate that, thank you. Steve, do you feel like your next question has been dealt with, or do you want to... Because I'm aware we're a little bit all over. Such is the enthusiasm of the committee. Okay. Nigel, probably a big question about run-on and benefits. We're sort of leading into that, actually.
Yeah, we saw some fascinating papers this week suggesting you were thinking of extending the run-on of housing benefit to fewer other benefits. Is that something that you are considering or willing to do, perhaps especially for ESA?
So, Nigel, obviously there's been quite a lot of speculation around all of this stuff, and I've said this in the House on Tuesday. I just want to repeat this: is the fact that what I don't think is going to be helpful if I, as a minister in this department, start speculating on speculation. I think
principle rather than speculation. Would you think that adding a couple more run-ons into the system would be a helpful way of smoothing the transition?
I think the speculation has been around what may or may not be in the budget. I don't think it would be helpful for me to start commenting on any of that. What I can say to you is that we've got. What I can say to you is that in last year's budget we had that £1.5 billion pounds, and that did contain 2 weeks of run-on. But I think in terms of going forward, I mean, we don't have long to wait, right? In terms of what may or may not be in the budget. But I really wouldn't want to speculate. I genuinely think this is a decision. I think, and Heidi alluded to this, is that this is a decision for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in terms of any matters for any department related to budgetary issues.
Which presumably means it's not built into your budget already, the idea of run-on. That would be an extra new thing for you to be able to afford to do. Don't ever play poker, Alok.
I mean, can we... I know you're trying very hard, Chair, to draw me to say something, but I mean, let's just sort of...
let's wait and see. Christmas is coming.
Wait and
okay.
See. Wait and see.
Okay. Should we move on to Rosie, who's got some general questions more about, kind of related, but transitional protection, to make sure that nobody loses out as they move across.
Okay, so what support will be made available to claimants as their migration deadline day approaches? So, we know that if they do miss any of their deadline days and don't respond to letters, they will lose their transitional protection. How can we make sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think I've answered some of this previously in terms of the work we want to do to make sure that doesn't happen. If we do terminate your legacy benefit and you don't have a good reason, and there are very narrow reasons to backdate, you will lose the chance of transitional protection, which is why we want to put all the effort that I was talking about into making sure that doesn't happen. The after the fact is no use to anybody here. We've got to try and get in front of this and make sure that doesn't happen. We want to pay the transitional protection. It's worth about £3.1 billion over this period. And as I said, I win no prizes for not spending that money.
Okay. Can I just ask a quick question, Rosie, if I may? I'm sure Ruth as well has got a lot on this. Do you feel that you have, and this isn't a budgetary question because we can always ask for more from the Chancellor, this is about process. Do you feel comfortable that you've identified every claimant type and every allowance type that might need protecting? For example, the reason I ask that, for example, in the regs currently there's severe disability payment. It's very loud and proud, it's in there, yep, that's being protected as we go across. But what happened to EDP? What happened to lower disability rate, child disability rate, things like that? How do you feel that you have definitely picked everything up?
So the way in which we've constructed how transitional protection will work, if you can bear with me for a minute here, what we do is we look at the legacy entitlements which may come from a number of sources. So all the benefits and tax credits that are being replaced by universal credit, we take the total for them. And say that was, I don't know, £1,000 in a calendar month. And then we do a notional entitlement to universal credit, and say that is 900. Then transitional protection would be £100, and we then take that, like any other element in universal credit, into that gross entitlement, and that then features in that gross entitlement, and that's how we achieve the commitment to not be on any less when you move on to universal credit. Now it's slightly complicated because you've got earnings in this calculation for many of the people here. So we're taking the earnings figure from the legacy environment and using that when we calculate the notional universal credit entitlement. So that's the claimant's advantage that we do that, so that we're not saying, we've got a new piece of information, your earnings have moved, therefore your UC entitlement this month would be lower, but that's just because of your earnings. So we take the thing that's advantageous to the claimant in all of this. It's a bit complicated to explain without whiteboards and the like, but it works, I say, in the claimant's advantage to use the old information and the old entitlement to say, well, that was your entitlement, this is your notional universal credit entitlement on the same information. and then that's the difference, and that's what we'll pay.
So that then stays, sorry, and then your UC, your earnings, that bit.
Yeah. So then it basically adds a top up to universal
to whatever
credit,
universal credit,
and then your
doing.
work allowance works across the top of that, and then your taper rate. So you're tapered from your universal credit, your transitional protection protected amount.
Just before I come to Ruth, can I, sorry, one slightly cheeky question, but I can't help it. If we know that the person used to receive £1,000 because this and this all added up and that's what it was, and the Brave New World is 900, so we need to top them up, that suggests you do know the data and how much they were receiving and what benefits they were on, so that suggests you do have access to data.
No, I've got to build this. So I've got to build this before we can move to test. I've got to build the transitional protection engine to calculate this, and I've got to work out.
But to be able to calculate it, it needs to know what's coming across from the old world. So if you know, I'm going back to the data on the pre-population question. Yeah. If you know the data to be able to calculate the transitional protection, why can't you use that data flow?
Yeah, well, the data piece I'm getting is what's the entitlement coming across. It's not the condition of that entitlement. It's not why did you get this bit or that bit. So I'm taking a gross entitlement amount for tax credits.
It's just a chunk of money. It's just
I'm just taking the gross entitlement. I'm not taking data around the nature of the claim. So if there was a disabled child in the home or not, I'm not taking that piece of information.
So it's just a lump of money.
I'm just getting that, and I remember I've got to do this from the local authority for housing benefit, from HMRC, and also from the legacy DWP systems as well.
So can I just, under tax credits, I mean, I, for example, was on those, and I had to ring every July and update them on my thing. How will someone working in the gig economy who has a different income each month, probably, how is the onus on them to phone who? Universal credit every month? I'm just trying to understand how that works.
So for universal credit, if they're in the gig economy and paying tax through HMRC, that's where the real time's earnings information comes through.
So you'll be that quick to react, right? It used to take me a year to get my claim sorted, and it was always reactionary.
That's what UC does.
Okay.
Ruth, thank you. Could I just, on that issue of transitional protection and earnings, that you're saying it's beneficial to claimants, that's obviously only the case if their earnings are rising, and therefore you're taking a lower figure which will then rise. Can I just say that because claimants' income changes from month to month, particularly in retail, which is a large proportion of the people who will be affected by universal credit, if you make that calculation of income in November, December, when they're on a lot of overtime, it will be very different to what they're on January to March. So remember, could I just ask you to...
No, Ms. George, I may not have explained this clearly, I probably went too quickly at the end. Okay? We're taking effectively, as Ms. Duffield spotted, we're taking what the tax credit earnings information is.
Right,
okay, we are not going to the claimant saying, "What did you earn this month?" Okay, we're taking that tax credit data, which is advantageous to the claimant because, well, it's not disadvantageous to the claimant because if they have variable earnings, if their earnings went up in the next month, they get the tapered effect on UC. But if their earnings had actually gone down, then they'll get the UC adjusting, but their transitional protection won't move. So
based on the average?
Well, no, the transitional protection is based on that point of time, so that we are effectively imagining a world where in the next month nothing changed, because we're trying to get this equilibrium between the old system and the new, and that's how we've designed it.
Okay, thank you. I mean, transitional protection is obviously going to be incredibly important because otherwise people are going to see huge drops in their income, as the Secretary of State has highlighted. That was what I was going to ask the Minister if he's...
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I mean, obviously there was a huge amount of concern raised on both sides of the House yesterday regarding those huge drops in income. We were very concerned as a committee that the Permanent Secretary came to us yesterday morning and said that that he wasn't sending the Secretary of State into the Chancellor with any requests for any additional funding. And that obviously has huge impacts on universal credit and the sort of claimants we're looking to protect. Can the Minister give us some assurance that the situation is much more fluid than that, and that the ministers are taking account of the views on both sides of the House of the huge amounts that people are set to lose under universal credit?
Well, look, so, I mean, once again, I think we're sort of verging into budget territory, and I'm sorry, I know I'm not being as helpful as you would like, but...
I'm asking if you're listening.
Well, you know, we've had sort of submissions from people. We're going to be responding to the Social Security Advisory Committee. So I would just say that if...
That's on the regs,
well,
that's not on the actual amounts.
Well, I would just say to you is that, you know, part of this whole process has been about, you know, listening to what people are saying. And let's just see, you know, what it is that is coming forth or not. I just want to go back to this point about the TP calculator. So what I would quite like to sort of offer, if you would be happy with this, Chair, is the appropriate time for us to have you know, you into the department, and we sort of explain to you precisely how the whole sort of process works in terms of the TP calculator, because that might be quite an interesting and useful thing to do anyway, to give you some comfort.
Thank you. Because it is very, very important, and as you said earlier, and as, to be fair, ministers have said all the way through, you're looking to protect the most vulnerable people. So why is it that people in temporary accommodation, homeless people and people subject to the benefit cap, who, it cannot be argued, are not some of the most vulnerable people, are excluded from transitional protection?
So do you want me to? Yes. So in those circumstances, I know whether the committee will know that their housing costs are not featuring inside of universal credit. So there's you know, it's effectively a technical reason why we can't apply transitional protection to them, because they're in. They're not really coming across to full UC, so there's some of the changes we made to...
Understanding, also, Ruth, to make sure I understand your question, are these people that are being paid, their housing is picked up as supported housing, as opposed to...
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, for example, we used to take into account temporary accommodation inside of universal credit. And some of the councils, I think it was Croydon, gave evidence to this committee, I think, said that this was causing them to have a cash flow problem because of the monthly assessment period, short durations in temporary accommodation, which is more expensive than standard accommodation, weren't being picked up, and they were being left with a cash gap. And they then had to pursue the claimants for that difference. So we cycled back out for those small number of cases, and said that their housing support will be provided through housing benefit, which does adjust on that sort of frequency for them, and that the rest of their sort of living costs, as it were, you know, maintenance costs would come through universal credit.
So that means that that's a deal, whatever they call themselves these days, MHDCLG budget, as opposed to yours, and hence your question then, Ruth, that any of the benefits that are coming across as part of DWP Transitional Protection, these people are not part of that then?
Yeah,
no.
So you know, it is in terms of because they're probably sound. I mean, I may rely on doing a more detailed note on this because it's quite hard to explain. But there are technical, legal reasons here why it is difficult, nay, impossible to provide transitional protection in those circumstances. But why don't I do you a little note on this, because it is a really complex area of social security law.
And sorry, just for Ruth's benefit, or for all our benefits, it'd be great if you could send that through to us. But does the bottom line in plain English mean that these people will have less money when they move across?
It will depend on their circumstances. So remember, there are quite a lot of people who move across who are gainers as well in this situation. But it would depend on the kind of characteristics of the claim. The majority of them, you know, because of the way in which because of either the short duration or of their claim, or the way in which we set up their claim with regard to universal credit already, won't be cash losers like in
by the nature of the type of the housing, it's very short.
Yeah. But But, and this is where, if I go back to our choices around how do we migrate, if we know somebody is in short-term temporary accommodation, leave them on their current arrangements until they do go into permanent accommodation, and then do the transition where the transitional protection could apply. So we've got some choices
you will give them
around
transitional protection at that point, even if it's possibly a change in circumstances.
If we you misunderstand, they haven't been moved across. You leave them in the legacy system. Remember, we've got 3 + 4 years to get this right. There'll be many changes of circumstances in and around that, and we can choose to do things at certain points.
To me, Ruth, it seems vital then that these claimants, if they are going to be losing as a consequence of half their money coming from a different department, they're exactly the sort of people that need to stay in the old system as long as possible then, until they're settled.
Yes, and the vast majority of them will either be single parents who've fled domestic violence or disabled people, both of whom are significant losers under universal credit. But I'm sorry, I've been listening to Mr. Couling for many years now, telling us that don't worry, we've got years and years before this is going to come into place. And we then end up in situations like this where we have little chance to actually scrutinise what's going on. So the committee, I'm sure, would like to have some assurances at this point before it happens, because otherwise we get such little opportunity to influence what's happening within the department with universal credit. Could I ask about benefit capped people as well, who aren't subject to the supported housing different budget, and why they're being denied transitional protection as well?
Again, there are it's rather complex technical reason in how the
they're
benefit
very vulnerable.
But they're benefit capped now under the legacy system. It's not through their housing benefit. I mean, I'll tell you what, I will, as you're fed up hearing my reassurances, I'll do you a note.
Heard them many years.
Over many years, yes, let the record show, over many years.
I suppose that's the point, isn't it? We want to understand, I don't want to use the word oddities because that's not how you should describe people, but the more unusual type of claimants that might be in there, not the mass regular types of migration. It's how these ones don't fall through the cracks. That's the important thing.
Absolutely, and it's about protecting the most vulnerable, as you've said.
Sorry, I'm just a little bit conscious of time.
I know, I've just got one other bit on this, which is around, and obviously the difference between natural migration and managed migration will be quite key, because obviously managed migration has the advantage of giving transitional protection if people do comply. At the moment, it seems there's quite a lot of uncertainty around the point at which people should be migrated onto universal credit. Naturally, we've had quite a lot of anecdotal evidence of people being given wrong advice, for example, by tax credit offices. Please, would the Minister write to the committee with very clear guidelines on when people will be, the circumstances in which people will be naturally migrated onto universal credit from legacy benefits, and also within universal credit, the changes of circumstance that would make them lose that transitional protection, because it's very important that those are clear to all concerned.
Yeah, okay.
And
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, because that was what I wanted to ask. It occurs to me, and I don't want to be flippant, but a change in circumstance almost feels like if the wind blows in a different direction, it's a change of circumstance.
Yeah.
They do, to me, seem to be an extraordinary list of...
Yes.
So in the regulations, there are a very limited number of changes of circumstances that you lose your transitional protection on. I think, have you got them there? Or I'll do it from memory. If you want time.
Brilliant,
all right, we'll do you a note.
It's the natural migration change of circumstances that are much more...
They're broad.
Yeah, because that's moved house, have a child. It's very broad, isn't it?
It was very specific back in summer 2012, which was what the impact assessment at the time was based on. And can I, Chair, beg your indulgence, Minister, you wrote to us regarding equality impact assessments and say that these have been done at every point. We're obviously looking at extremely vulnerable people in this, with lots of protected characteristics and in extremely high numbers. will the Minister look to publish the equality impact assessment on the whole of the revised system of universal credit as it now stands with cuts? We're happy to wait until after the budget, and hopefully we'll see some changes in that. But it would be really helpful and make sure that this is transparent as possible so that none of us can be accused of scaremongering, whether on this side or with the Secretary of State statements about the amount people are going to lose. If we have a very clear statement on who's going to lose, when, and what sort of people, would be most helpful to hopefully put to bed all of the concerns that people have if they are unfounded regarding universal credit.
Well, obviously what we don't do is routinely publish these, as you're aware.
But it's 2012, I think, was the last one, wasn't it?
So we don't routinely publish these, but clearly, you know, it is also a sort of iterative process, as you said. As we gain more evidence, it will change. I will take away, what I'm not going to do here is sort of make a commitment to it, because I don't think that would be appropriate. Obviously I'm listening, we'll take away what the committee's asked for, but I would just also say that routinely this is not something that we would publish.
But could you say with any confidence, Ruth, that going back to, it's 11 and 12 when they were last done, can you honestly say that the world of UC now, let alone what we've got coming down the road of managed migration, could possibly have been covered as far back as 2012, 6 years ago? I mean, to me, it feels like a different world we're in now, and it needs a refreshed assessment.
Well, look, we will go back and sort of, discuss internally what is or isn't possible. But I do not want to leave the committee with a sort of view that this is certainly something that's going to happen, because we wouldn't routinely do it.
Okay.
I just wanted to go back and clarify a tiny point about these people living in supportive or specified accommodation. If I understood correctly, Mr. Couling was saying we don't need to worry too much about that because we're going to retain them on the legacy benefits until we resolve this, and then we'll move them across. I understand, and I understand partly from a parliamentary answer, there's quite a high volume of elderly people fall into that category, because it's not unusual for elderly people to end up living in what the council classes as supportive accommodation, but without requiring any care. And they're exactly the people who will not qualify for the housing element, but currently get housing benefit. And what's happened in the past, when someone like that has transferred across, they have not been eligible for the housing element, and they've been told that they are entitled to housing benefit. But in fact, the councils have challenged this, and so what the department has done so far has put those people back to their legacy benefits and said, we'll resolve this at a later stage. Is that what you were referring to when you said we'll hold them on the legacy benefits? And if that's the case, have you any idea how many people we're talking about? Because I would have thought that was a fair chunk of the elderly population.
So let me be clear what I said and what we're talking about here. You're talking about elderly people.
Yeah.
They're not on universal credit. They'll be on some form of pension credit, probably with housing benefit paid for here. The proposals that the government changed around supported housing, and I'm going up the far limit of my memory here now, did I think involve pensioners, but the government changed its mind around some of that. Yeah. What I was talking about, and maybe Ms. George is hearing too many reassurances over a long period of time to ever listen to me again, but I was saying we will have some choices, because we reversed for universal credit claimants. Okay, we left them in temporary accommodation on housing benefit. We will have a choice for people on housing benefit now in temporary accommodation who are on their legacy benefits about when do we move them over to universal credit. So there may be a possibility there to configure that process in a way that a transitional protection calculation is possible. I don't know today. I'm speculating around that. I did have a note somewhere in all this paper about the specific issue, but I can't put my finger on it at the moment, so it's going to be easier if I write back to you on it. But I think your worry about elderly pension credit.
Yeah, could you do that? Because I'm just curious to know how big a problem that is likely to be, and therefore how much attention it's going to require. That's what my interest is.
Around temporary accommodation, these are typically short duration, people cycling into temporary accommodation maybe after a life event, that's horrible, like domestic abuse.
Yeah, when I say big, I mean the numbers of people.
Yeah, but so you might see a large number doing it, but their durations are not long, and that's why we've got the housing benefit system to pick up the strain on that. And we basically zero their housing costs around universal credit because of that, because it's being paid through housing benefit.
Well, I'll be interested to see the note.
Yeah.
Unless anybody's got any killer questions, I was going to shoot down to the end. So the big question, do we know when the regs are going to come? How long will we have to scrutinise them, and will we get debate, and how long will we have before we have debate?
So I think on all of those I can answer shortly.
Yes, Minister.
Look, I mean, I think we obviously need to lay them. We need to have a debate in the House.
So we will definitely get a debate.
They're under the affirmative.
Oh yes, absolutely. There will be a debate. There will absolutely be a debate.
There'll be no, by the point the regulations are laid, then there is no opportunity to put amendments to them, is there? Which is why this committee would have appreciated the opportunity to have a look at your response to the SAC report before those regulations are laid.
Okay. So again, I don't know whether the committee put in a formal submission to SAC or not. I'm not aware whether you did.
No, I guess we're using this session now and our follow-up from today to
okay.
To do
so
that.
I think much of what has been raised today is also what has been raised by other stakeholders, and going back to the point about sort of timetable, obviously we want to make sure that we have these regs passed before the end of this year, so we are ready at the start of next year. And I mean, one of the key issues is, of course, the in terms of severe disability premiums, making sure that we have a hard gateway which is put in place. Now, that is something that, I mean, Neil will want to sort of comment on this, but that is currently being built. But the intention is that, as quickly as possible, we can get that sort of put in, so those individuals aren't moving across and losing out in the.
Although you could split that out and put that in a separate set of regulations, presumably.
Well, I think so. I think there is an issue of sort of the parliamentary timetable as well. So we just want to make sure that we get the regs obviously through before the end of this year. So going back to the point about when they will when will we respond to SAC, when we relay the regs, it will be shortly.
Okay, and opportunities, if you're not able, as per Ruth's suggestion, to share the regs with us as like a last draft scrutiny, if you like, beforehand, what is the process for amending them once they're laid? Because CMS have just done it.
I'm sorry?
CMS have just done it. Some
Okay.
CMS
well,
regs
I think so. One of the things that when you raise that point about being able to sort of see these, I will go away and discuss that, obviously, with the Secretary of State, and then we will form a decision on what we think is the best way of going forward. But I just want to be very clear, is that the points that the committee is raising, very many of them are points that other stakeholders have obviously echoed as well. And clearly with some of them they will have talked to you, so you can emphasise to us what is important.
Yeah.
So if we could actually see the SSAC report with your response, then it would enable us to raise different issues.
As Ruth, I'll say again, is that I will go away and have that discussion and see whether we think that's possible or not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very lively session. Thank you very, very much, Alok.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.